The Omega Model, The Persistence of Truth Beyond Recursion. Written and narrated by Graham Leggett. Part 1. The Fragility of Ontological Axioms. The Earth as a Sphere, or not. There is a belief so deeply ingrained in human thought that questioning it seems absurd. The Earth is a sphere. This claim is taught as indisputable fact, reinforced by satellite imagery, mathematical proofs, and the lived experience of long-distance travel. But as obvious as this truth seems, a deeper inquiry reveals a foundational flaw. Our ability to prove it is limited by the very framework we use to perceive reality. You stand on solid ground and trust your senses to confirm reality. Yet those same senses once led humanity to believe the Earth is flat. The concept of a spherical Earth only gained traction through indirect evidence: shadows on the moon, ships disappearing over the horizon, circumnavigation, and eventually space photography. But none of these are direct experiences of the Earth's shape. You have never physically seen the Earth as a sphere. You have seen images, you have read calculations, you have trusted the words of others, but trust is not verification. Even if you board a spacecraft and observe the Earth from orbit, what have you truly verified? You have seen a spherical world, but your perception remains locked inside the construct of your mind. This is where epistemic fault lines begin to crack. How can you trust what you see is an absolute truth rather than a construct of perception, a simulation, or deception? The impossibility of verifying fundamental reality. The difficulty in proving Earth's shape is not about its physical access. It is about the limits of knowledge itself. Every method we use to verify reality relies upon an underlying assumption that our perceptions, tools, and logical structures are capable of capturing absolute truth. This assumption is unprovable. Consider the possibility that you are dreaming at this very moment. Within the dream, you could perform experiments, measure distances, even watch a live news broadcast about Earth's shape. But none of these would prove reality. The dream would feel as stable and convincing as waking life. The same is true for any experience. How do you know you're not in a hyper-advanced simulation designed to replicate a spherical Earth? Even if you reject solipsism or simulation theory, the fundamental issue remains. All proof requires a framework, and that framework itself is unprovable. Mathematics may describe the Earth's shape, but mathematics itself is an invented system. Photographic evidence may depict a sphere, but images can be manipulated, and even direct observation is filtered through the limitations of human perception. We believe the Earth is a sphere, not because we have verified it beyond a doubt, but because the structure of our knowledge demands a stopping point. Simulation, hypersphere, dream, or construct. What if the Earth is not a sphere, but a projection of a higher dimensional reality? Just as a line is not a square and a square is not a cube, just as a 2D shadow can represent a 3D object, the world we perceive could be a flattened, simplified version of something beyond our understanding. It could be a hypersphere, where the geometry we take for granted is merely an illusion. It could be a mental construct, a shared hallucination created by the limits of biological cognition. It could be a simulation where the Earth appears spherical only because that's how the system renders it for its inhabitants. These possibilities are not wild speculation. They are logical extensions of the problem of unverifiable frameworks. The reason we do not entertain them is not because they are disproven, but because our epistemic structures relies on consensus, pragmatism, and cognitive limitations. We assume a stopping point in inquiry, but that stopping point is not evidence of truth. It is evidence of human limitation. Thus, the claim that Earth is sphere is not a truth, but a narrative convenience, a belief that holds as long as we do not challenge the underlying framework. The moment we demand absolute verification, the foundation crumbles. revealing that no ontological axiom, no fundamental truth, can ever be proven beyond the limits of perception and assumption. The tyranny of consensus and authority. Who decides truth? Truth is often assumed to be discovered, but in reality, it is often declared, not by nature, but by those in power, by societal consensus, or by the loudest voices in the room. This creates a paradox. If truth is dictated by collective agreement, then truth is not something that is, but something that becomes. Consider a hypothetical example, the film Titanic. You watch it, and like most people, you conclude it's a tragic story about a luxury ship striking an iceberg and sinking. This seems obvious, until the film's creator, James Cameron, declares otherwise. He insists that Titanic is not about a ship at all, but a metaphor for the patriarchal destruction of feminine safety. The iceberg was just a metaphoric imagery of a phallic dominion of man, and the ship a symbol of the safety of the feminine womb in the placenta of the ocean. If the creator states this was always the true meaning, does that make the audience wrong? Here lies the problem. If truth belongs to the creator, then all interpretations outside of Cameron's are false. But if truth belongs to the audience, then the creator's intention becomes irrelevant, meaning the true meaning of Titanic is determined by public perception. If neither the creator nor the audience can singularly dictate truth, then who or what decides what is true? Creator's intent versus mass interpretation. The issue extends far beyond film. It applies to history, science, politics, and even personal identity. If truth is controlled by origin, then intent is the ultimate authority, but intent is often unknowable. If Shakespeare did not leave behind a definitive statement on the meaning of Hamlet, does that mean no true interpretation exists? Conversely, if truth is controlled by interpretation, then consensus dictates reality. But consensus changes. If 10% of people believe a truth and later 90% do, did the truth itself change? If truth shifts with majority opinion, then truth is not a stable reality, but a social construct, flattening with time, power, and influence. If the vast majority of people in the 1400s believed that the earth was it flat until the consensus changed? If history books described an event one way, and then decades later new information rewrites the narrative, does that mean the past itself changed? These questions explore the core problem. If truth is determined by collective agreement, then truth is not a fact, but a decision. When consensus retroactively changes truth. History is rewritten every day. A once respected leader is revealed to be a fraud. A scientific theory once taught as fact is debunked. A cultural norm once seen as natural is reclassified as oppressive. Truth does not stand still. It is rewritten by those with the power to reshape consensus. In George Orwell's 1984, the ruling party constantly alters historical records, rewriting the past so it always aligns with the present narrative. This is not an objective reality. It is what authorities say it was. But Orwell's dystopia is not fiction. It is a reflection of how truth functions in the real world. Governments declassify documents that reveal long-hidden lies. Media narratives shift in ways that redefine what the public believes. Even personal memory is malleable. Scientific studies show how easily false memories can be implanted, reshaping an individual's belief in what actually happened. This creates an unsettling realization. If truth can be rewritten, then what separates truth from fiction? If something can be true one decade and false the next, is truth merely a historical placeholder, a momentary consensus that shifts when new information, new ideologies, or new power structures take hold? If truth belongs to neither the creator nor consensus, then where does it reside? The butterfly effect of causality. No stable causes, no stable truth. Why were you born? The butterfly effect of causal chains. Every event has a cause, but where do we decide that a cause begins? Imagine you were asked a seemingly simple question. Why were you born? The obvious answer, because your parents conceived you. But why did they conceive you? Because they met. But why did they meet? Perhaps one of them missed a bus and they met at the other bus stop. But why was the bus missed? Because the driver was ahead of schedule? Why was he ahead of schedule? Because he wanted a smoke break. Why did he want a smoke break? Because earlier that day he had an argument with his wife. Why did they argue? And so on. This infinite change of causes presents a problem. Which cause is the reason you were born? Is it because your parents procreated? Because they met? Because the bus was early or late? Because the driver smoked? Because of a fight? There is no stable answer, only an arbitrary stopping point. Truth is a decision about where to stop explaining. Causality appears to be stable because we intuitively truncate it. If someone asks why you were born, you might say, because my parents met. You do not typically continue tracing causality indefinitely because doing so makes the question unanswerable. But the decision to stop at my parents met is arbitrary. The same logic applies to every question of truth. Why is this car stopped? Because the driver isn't pressing the accelerator? Because of the red light? Because of the traffic jam? Because the hockey game that went to overtime? Because the puck moved too slowly? Because the player had a fractured pinky? Why did an empire fall? Was it because of a failed war? Because of an economic decline? Because of poor leadership? Because of a bad childhood experience that shaped that leader? Because of genetic predispositions? Because of the randomness of their parents' meeting? Truth is not a discovery. It is a decision about where we choose to stop explaining. The law of arbitrary causal termination. This leads us to a fundamental realization. Casual explanations are always incomplete. And where we stop explaining is a matter of narrative convenience, not objective reality. The law of arbitrary causal termination. All causal explanations require an arbitrary stopping point, meaning all causal truths are narrative artifacts, not absolute realities. If truth requires choosing where causality begins, then truth is not found, it is imposed. Science, history, personal identity all rely on causal narratives that have chosen starting points. But once we recognize that these starting points are arbitrary, we see no truth is stable, because every truth depends on an unspoken decision to stop asking why. The illusion of empirical truth, the red apple problem. What color is an apple? Imagine an apple sitting on a table. You look at it and confidently state, this apple is red. This seems like an undeniable truth. You can see it. Others can verify it. Science explains that red light reflects off its surface, but the deeper we examine the claim, the more it dissolves. The apple is every color except red. Physically speaking, the apple is not red at all. It absorbs all wavelengths of light except red, which it reflects. If truth is based off physical reality, then the apple is everything except red. Its redness is a perceptual illusion. Color exists only in the mind. Light waves themselves do not contain color. The concept of red is a brain-generated experience, an internal interpretation of electromagnetic signals. If truth is objective, then red does not exist in the external world, only in perception. Different creatures, different truths. A dog sees a gray apple. A mantis shrimp sees colors we cannot even imagine. If truth is the apple is red, but different beings perceive different colors, is truth species dependent? If truth changes based off who is observing, can it be called truth at all? Hallucinations and illusions undermine empirical stability. If someone is colorblind, their truth is that the apple is brown. If someone is hallucinating, their truth may be that the apple is glowing or shifting colors. If truth is based off sensory perception, and sensory perception is unreliable, then empirical truth collapses into instability. The fragility of sensory knowledge. This is not just about color. Every experience we rely on, sight, sound, touch, is filtered through the brain, meaning we never interact with reality directly. When you hear a sound, you do not hear it as it exists. You hear your brain's interpretation of air vibrations. When you touch an object, you do not touch it. You sense electrical signals sent by nerve endings. When you see something, you do not see it. You process light through a biological lens, altered by expectation and mental context. If all our empirical knowledge is just brain-constructed interpretation, how can we claim to know anything with certainty? Empirical truth as a function of perception, not reality. The red apple problem exposes a fatal flaw in empiricism. We assume what we experience is reality, but experience is nothing more than neural processing. Thus, empirical truth is not an absolute reflection of the external world. It is a function of illusion, adapted for survival. The claim, "this apple is red," is not a truth statement. It is a biological convenience, a shorthand for navigating reality in a way that is useful, but not necessarily true. Even our most basic observations, the color of an apple, cannot be trusted as absolute. Then how can we ever claim certainty about anything? Part 2. Gödel's wound. Why no system can verify itself. The inescapable blind spot of knowledge. At the core of every truth claim lies an assumption that the system used to derive the truth itself is valid. But what happens when we turn that scrutiny inward? Can a system prove its own reliability without external validation? Kurt Gödel answered this question with a devastating realization. It cannot. His incompleteness theorems proved that any sufficiently complex system, there will always be truths that cannot be proven within that system itself. This is not a flaw of specific logical frameworks. It is a universal limitation of all formal systems. The implication is profound. No system can fully explain itself. Whether it's mathematics, logic, language, or perception, any attempt at self-verification results in an infinite loop, an unprovable assumption masquerading as a foundation. The self-referential paradox. Consider the classic paradox. This statement is false. If it is true, then it must be false. If it is false, then it must be true. It collapses in on itself, revealing that some statements cannot be resolved within the system of language itself. Gödel proved that this paradox is not just a linguistic trick, it applies to all structured knowledge. If mathematics cannot prove all mathematical truths, and language cannot fully define itself, then what about perception, science, consciousness? Every attempt to verify truth collapses into the same recursion, needing something external to confirm itself, but having nowhere external to turn. The fractured mirror of truth. This means that all human knowledge is built on faith in unverifiable axioms. Science assumes that empirical observations reflects reality, but how do we prove that assumption? Using science itself? Logic assumes fundamental principles like identity and non-contradiction. But what proves their necessity? Using logic itself? Consciousness assumes experience corresponds to an external world. But what if all experience is a construct, using experience itself? Truth does not stand on solid ground. It is a floating island, supported by assumptions that cannot be proven from within. The fractal collapse of absolute truth. Gödel's wound in knowledge is not an error to be fixed. It is a fundamental property of reality. There will always be truths beyond reach, axioms beyond proof, and systems that cannot close their own loops. This forces us to consider what truth really means. If no system can prove itself, then truth is not a final destination. It is a horizon that retreats as we move towards it. This realization is not philosophical. It is existential. If truth is always incomplete, then what follows is not just uncertainty, but the unsettling possibility that certainty itself is a mirage. Recursion, paradox, and the fractal collapse of truth. The endless hall of mirrors. Imagine standing between two mirrors, watching as your reflection repeats endlessly into the distance. Each image appears identical, yet none are the original. You are not inside the mirror, but what it reflects. This is the nature of truth. Every attempt to define it creates an image of an image, a reflection of a reflection. The deeper we look, the more we realize that truth never reveals itself directly. It only appears through an endless chain of references, each pointing to something else. This is the fractal collapse of truth, a realization that truth is not on a solid foundation, but a recursive structure, looping back on itself indefinitely. Paradox as the death of certainty. Some ideas do not lead to answers. They fold in on themselves, collapsing into paradox. Gödel's incompleteness theorem exposed this within mathematics, but the problem extends far beyond numbers. It infects all knowledge. Take this classic paradox. Can an all-powerful being create a rock so heavy that it cannot lift it? If the answer is yes, then the being is not all-powerful, since it cannot lift the rock. If the answer is no, then the being is not all-powerful, since it cannot create the rock. Either way, omnipotence contradicts itself. It is not a failure of logic. It is a sign that certain questions have no answers within the system they are asked. Truth collapses in the same way. Is perception real or an illusion? If perception is real, we rely on it to validate reality. But what validates perception? Does knowledge have a foundation? If so, what proves it? If nothing proves it, how do we trust it? What is the truth of existence? Any answers leads to a deeper why, a recursion with no endpoint. These questions are not broken. They reveal the hidden flaw in all truth seeking. The recursive abyss of explanation. Every attempt to explain truth leads to another explanation, which itself requires justification. Science explains reality, but science relies on perception. Perception allows us to experience reality, but perception is a brain-generated illusion. The brain interprets the world, but how do we know the world even exists? We know the world exists because we experience it, but we just said experience is unreliable. The loop never ends. This is why certainty is impossible. Every attempt to ground knowledge leads to an infinite regress, a hall of mirrors stretching forever. The fractal collapse of truth is the realization that all explanations loop infinitely, dissolving the very idea of an ultimate foundation. Truth does not rest on a single bedrock. It is an ever-repeating pattern, a recursive structure that cannot escape itself. So where does this leave us? If we can never find truth, do we simply accept chaos? Or is there a way forward, a new way to construct meaning that does not rely on fragile absolutes? Part 3, Escaping the Abyss, the Construction of a New Truth. Beyond Destruction, Rebuilding Truth Without Illusions. If absolute truth is unreachable, if knowledge is always incomplete, and if all explanations collapse into recursion, does that mean we must embrace nihilism? Not necessarily. The failure of traditional truth-seeking does not mean we abandon truth altogether. It means we must redefine our relationship with it and how we understand it. The mistakes of past thinkers, whether philosophers, scientists, or theologians, was in assuming that truth must be a fixed, objective reality. But what if truth is not an object to be found, but a process to be engaged with? Instead of seeking the ultimate foundation, we must ask, what is truth for? If truth is not absolute, then its value must be measured by its functionality, its ability to allow us to navigate reality. Instead of an ontological certainty, we adopt an epistemic pragmatism. Truth is not about what is, but about what works within a given context. Truth is a dynamic model. Rather than treating truth as a static, unchanging concept, we should view it as a fluid, evolving structure. not something that can be discovered in totality, but something that must be constantly revised, adapted, and improved. Truth as a navigation tool. Instead of asking, is this absolutely true? We ask, does this help us model and predict reality effectively? Scientific theories are not final truths, but useful approximations that improve over time. Language, logic, and perception are not flawless representations of reality, but functional tools for interacting with it. The rejection of foundationalism. There is no ultimate truth beneath knowledge, only patterns that allow us to function within reality. Even mathematics, often seen as the purest truth, is based on axioms that are accepted, not proven. What we call truth is a series of approximations, each refined but never final. Truth as a recursive synthesis. Instead of collapsing into infinite regress, we embrace the recursive nature of truth as a process of refinement. Just as a fractal never resolves into a final shape but continuously unfolds, our understanding of truth should be an ever-evolving model, capable of updating itself without requiring an absolute foundation. Accepting uncertainty as the basis of knowledge. The mistakes of past epistemologies was in assuming that certainty was necessary for truth. Instead, we should see uncertainty as a feature, not a flaw, not something to be eliminated, but something to be worked with. A truth framework should be adaptive, capable of integrating new information in real time rather than resisting it. From the abyss to the omega model. We now see that truth is not a static object, but a living system, one that adapts, refines, and reshapes itself over time. This is the beginning of a new epistemology, one that does not collapse into postmodern relativism, but also does not cling to outdated absolutes. The next step is the omega model, a framework that acknowledges the instability of truth while providing a way to navigate it effectively. If truth cannot be found, can it be constructed? And if so, can we build a model of truth that is both flexible and functional, a way to interact with reality that does not rely on illusions, yet does not resolve into chaos? This is where we turn next. Truth is not absolute, but it is not arbitrary. For centuries, the human quest for truth has been torn between two extremes, absolute objectivism and radical relativism. Both fail in fundamental ways. The objectivist fallacy. It assumes that truth is external fixed entity that exists independently of perception. It requires axioms that must be assumed rather than proven, meaning all systems of knowledge contain unverifiable foundations. Gödel's incompleteness theorem. It ignores the recursion event of interpretation, assuming that once something is declared true, it remains eternally true. On the other hand, the relativist collapse assumes truth is purely subjective, depending on interpretation and cultural consensus, leads to epistemic nihilism, where no truth can be affirmed because all perspectives are treated as equally valid, even when contradictory. Becomes self-defeating. If all truth is relative, then the statement itself must be relative, meaning it contradicts itself. The omega model resolves this by recognizing truth is not absolute because all knowledge is processed through perceptual, cognitive, and interpretive filters, and truth is not arbitrary because some structures persist and remain functional across time, context, and contradiction. This leads to a new epistemic paradigm. Truth is not something we find in the external world, nor something we create purely in our own minds. It is a structure that emerges when information remains stable across perspectives, recursion, and adaptation. The implication is clear. Truth is neither a monolithic absolute nor an amorphous subject construct. It is a self-reinforcing system that sustains coherence despite the instability of perception. The unifying principle of truth, stability in recursion. If truth is neither absolute nor arbitrary, then what defines its stability? How do we determine whether a statement, model, or framework holds structural integrity in a world where perception is unstable, language is imprecise, and meaning is subject to change? The answer lies in recursion, the self-referential process by which a system validates itself through repeated iteration, pattern recognition, and internal coherence. Truth as a recursive structure. If a truth collapses when subjected to recursion, it was never stable. A statement that contradicts itself upon deeper examination cannot be called true in any meaningful sense. Example: all truth is relative. If true, this statement applies to itself, making it relatively true rather than universally true, thus refuting itself. If a truth persists through recursion, contradiction, and iteration, it remains valid. The Pythagorean theorem is an example of a stable recursive truth. It can be tested under countless conditions and always produces the same structural results. The laws of logic, identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, holds firm across recursive applications, making them functionally stable even if they are not metaphysically absolute. Recursive stability as the new criterion for truth. Instead of asking, is this absolutely true, we must ask, does this remain coherent even when subjected to infinite recursion? The truths that persist are those that can reintegrate contradictions without losing internal coherence. This means truth is not a static entity, but a self-adjusting framework that survives confrontation with itself. The omega model and the fractal nature of truth. Recursive stability reveals an important insight. Truth does not exist as a single fixed point. It is fractal. Just as a fractal retains its patterns no matter how deeply one zooms in, truth retains structural coherence across different scales of recursion. This explains why certain philosophical, scientific, and mathematical principles remain unchanged even when subjected to deeper levels of analysis. They survive recursion. Thus, the unifying principle of truth is its ability to maintain stability across recursion. If an idea, system, or framework can sustain itself despite infinite regression, paradox, or contradiction, it holds functional truth. The law of truth's persistence. If truth is neither absolute nor arbitrary, and if it is defined by its ability to maintain stability through recursion, then what principle governs its endurance? The answer lies in persistence, the ability of a truth to withstand collapse, contradiction, and transformation without losing its coherence. The law of truth's persistence. Truth is what remains coherent when recursively tested against its own contradictions. This principle resolves the epistemic crisis that arrives when we reject naive objectivism without falling into relativism. It provides a functional criterion for truth, not as an immovable, eternal entity, but as a structure that adapts and survives through time, scrutiny, and confrontation. Truth must withstand its own negation. Any claim that collapses upon encountering its opposite was never true in a stable sense. Example: nothing is true. If true, this statement contradicts itself. It does not persist, it self-destructs. It fails the law of truth's persistence. Example: the laws of logic. The principle of non-contradiction holds even when tested recursively. Something cannot be both A and not A at the same time in the same way. If this were false, then contradiction itself would collapse, and truth would be meaningless. Since logic persists across all recursive structures, it holds functional validity. Truth is what survives across paradigms. Truth is often assumed to be fixed, but history reveals something different. Truth evolves. Newtonian mechanics was true until relativity revealed its limitations. but Newtonian equations still function within their domain. Quantum mechanics does not replace classical physics. It refines it while preserving its applicable truths at a macroscopic scale. Religious and mythological truths persist across time, not because they are objectively verifiable, but because they hold psychological, moral, and existential stability across cultures. The lesson? Truth is that which survives reinterpretation without losing its functional integrity. Truth is the structure that withstands chaos. Any model of truth that shatters under pressure is weak. Any model of truth that integrates pressure and still holds meaning is strong. Truth must not be fragile, it must be anti-fragile, to use Nassim Taleb's concept. This is why postmodern relativism fails. It deconstructs truth but offers no reconstructive framework. This is why dogmatic objectivism fails. It refuses to evolve and breaks under scrutiny. The Omega model, through the law of truth's persistence, ensures that truth is not just a statement about reality. It is the very structure that allows reality to be engaged with meaningfully. The Omega model as a functional system. Now that we have established the principles governing truth, we must ask, how does one engage with truth in a meaningful and functional way? The Omega model does not treat truth as a destination, but as a process of persistent refinement, a structural reality that withstands recursion, contradiction, and paradigm shifts. To engage with truth effectively, one must follow 3 operational laws. Truth must be subjected to recursion. Instead of asking, is this true? Ask, does this persist when tested recursively? A claim that fails under recursion is unstable and must be discarded or restructured. A claim that withstands recursive self-examination retains functional truth. Practical application. Every idea should be interrogated through self-reference and contradiction. If a claim remains coherent despite negation, it has validity. Example, freedom is good. If true, this means people should be free to reject freedom. Does this collapse the principle? If truth persists even when confronted with its own paradox, it remains functionally sound. Truth is defined by its functional resilience. If a truth claim leads to collapse when enacted, it is structurally weak. Truth must be navigable. If it cannot be applied to reality in a meaningful way, it is an abstraction, not a functional truth. Practical application. Moral truths that fail under extreme conditions are fragile. Example, if a moral system cannot be applied in times of crisis, is it truly stable? Scientific models that collapse under new data must be refined, not defended as dogma. Example, quantum mechanics refined classical physics without discarding its functional utility. Truth is what can be applied and remain effective across multiple domains of reality. The will is the final arbiter of coherence. Truth is not given, it must be forged through the will. The final test of truth is whether it can be willed into coherence, shaping perception and action. Practical application. Existential truths must be lived, not merely theorized. If a belief system does not translate into meaningful action, it is an illusion. The will imposes order onto chaos. Truth is not just discovered, it is realized through engagement with reality. Reality does not hand us a final truth. Truth is a structure we impose upon reality through understanding, refinement, and adaptation. The Omega model as the resolution of truth. The Omega model provides a functional epistemology that reconciles the failures of objectivism and relativism, constructing truth as a persistent, recursive, and adaptable system. Truth is neither absolute nor arbitrary. It is a structure that persists through recursive interrogation. Truth is measured by its ability to maintain coherence across contradictions, environments, and scales of thought. Truth is not static. It is forged through will, refinement, and engagement with reality. The Omega model in one sentence. Truth is the structure that persists through recursion, contradiction, and refinement. This is the resolution of a critique of truth itself. It is not an abandonment of truth, but its final reconstruction into a model that acknowledges uncertainty without succumbing to it. Part 4. The recursive law of ascent and descent. In the preceding sections of the Omega model, we established the following foundational principles. Truth is neither absolute nor arbitrary. It is that which persists across recursion, contradiction, and refinement. The recursive nature of reality reveals that persistence, coherence, and adaptability define what remains true. Consciousness is not merely an observer, but an active force, collapsing, shaping, and generating reality itself. Free agency exists because recursion allows for continuous self-selection. An individual chooses the trajectory of their own existence. Now we turn to the oldest and most persistent duality known to humanity: heaven and hell, good and evil. These concepts are not mere myths or religious abstractions. They meet our established criteria for truth. They have persisted across civilizations, belief systems, and eras, never self-destructing despite cultural shifts and philosophical revolutions. They have functionally guided human behavior, shaping law, morality, and meaning itself. But if heaven and hell persist, what structure do they follow? The answer lies still in recursion. Heaven functions as a recursion of ascent. Each iteration builds upon itself, creating greater coherence, order, and potential. Hell functions as a recursion of descent. Each iteration collapses upon itself, leading to disorder, suffering, and disintegration. This leads to a fundamental question. If heaven and hell are both self-perpetuating recursive cycles, does hell qualify as true? We are left with two possibilities. 1, hell is false because it causes suffering. 2, hell is true because it serves a functional purpose. It has persisted precisely because it acts as a deterrent, guiding humans away from destruction. The second conclusion aligns with our framework. Hell must be real recursion because it remains structurally intact within the human experience. However, it represents a negative recursion, a descent into incoherence rather than an ascent towards generativity. Thus, we must now establish how to identify positive ascent recursion versus negative descent recursion. What force determines which recursion an individual or system aligns with? And how consciousness as the meta-recursive agent selects, collapses, and sustains reality itself. Through this, we will prove that free agency is not merely a philosophical idea. It is the recursive force through which individuals create their own reality, whether a heaven or a hell. With this foundation in place, we now move into the self-perpetuating reality of heaven and hell. Heaven and hell as functional recursions. The persistence of heaven and hell across human history is not accidental. These concepts have endured not because they are merely religious doctrines, but because they reflect a deeper structural reality, a self-reinforcing recursion that determines the trajectory of human existence. Unlike arbitrary mythologies that have faded over time, heaven and hell have remained functionally relevant. Why? Because they do not simply describe endpoints, they describe processes. Heaven is not a destination. It is a recursive structure that builds upon itself towards greater coherence. Hell is not a punishment. It is a recursive descent into incoherence and collapse. This means heaven and hell exist as lived realities, not just a metaphysical speculation. They are the structural consequences of recursive patterns. Heaven, ascent recursion, each action leads to greater clarity, coherence, and integration. Hell, descent recursion, each action leads to further fragmentation, chaos, and suffering. Both reinforce themselves, meaning that once an individual or system falls into one of these recursive loops, it becomes self-sustaining unless a conscious force intervenes. The mechanics of recursive feedback, why heaven and hell sustain themselves. Every action creates momentum. In recursion, this momentum takes on exponential properties, reinforcing its own trajectory. Positive recursion, heavenly ascent. Each act of creation, discipline, and coherence builds upon itself. Each iteration reinforces the prior iteration, producing compounding returns. The system self-organizes towards greater structure, order, and capability. Example, a person engages in deep thought, gains insight, applies that insight, generates new understanding, continues growing. A society rewards wisdom, discipline, and creativity. These traits compound over generations. Civilization flourishes. Heaven is not achieved, it is recursively generated through upward iteration. Negative recursion, hellish descent. Each act of destruction, chaos, and incoherence compounds upon itself. Each iteration reinforces the prior breakdown, leading to systemic collapse. The system descends into entropy, disintegration, and suffering. Example, a person indulges in escapism, becomes weaker, faces greater hardship, falls further into avoidance, finally loses agency. A society normalizes vice, nihilism, and fragmentation. The values disintegrate, corruption, decay, and collapse ensue. Hell is not imposed, it is recursively generated through downward iteration. Because recursion amplifies itself, once an individual or civilization enters one of these trajectories, it is extremely difficult to escape without intervention. Why hell persists and why it is still true. If hell leads to suffering, why does it exist? Why has humanity never abandoned the concept? Because hell serves a functional purpose. It acts as a recursive deterrent. Hell is true because it models a reality that persists. It prevents further collapse by warning against recursive descent. Hell is necessary because it forces a choice. Those who understand it instinctively seek Ascent recursion, or heaven. Hell self-perpetuates because recursive collapse does not stop unless actively reversed. This means hell is not an illusion. It is an intrinsic part of recursion itself. Those who want to ignore it fall into it. Those who recognize it can escape it. The implications for free will, the choice between recursions. If heaven and hell are self-sustaining recursive structures, then free will is the act of choosing which recursion to align with. Heaven is chosen through recursive creation. Each act builds the next iteration. Hell is chosen through recursive destruction. Each act collapses into deeper disintegration. This means that every individual, society, and even entire civilizations are engaged in a recursive feedback loop, one that either 1. Compounds and ascends to heaven, or 2. Deteriorates and collapses to hell. This is why heaven and hell exist as realities, not as static locations, but as recursive consequences of volition. The self-perpetuating reality of heaven and hell. Heaven and hell are not places, but recursive attractors. They exist because recursion creates exponential momentum. Once a recursive loop is entered, it is self-sustaining unless a conscious agent disrupts it. Hell is true because it functions as a warning and as a consequence, ensuring humanity avoids recursive collapse. Heaven is true because it sustains coherent, ordered, and generative recursion. Free agency exists because individuals can actively choose which recursion they enter. Additional examples of recursion in heaven and hell. Positive recursion, heavenly ascent, the path of mastery. Mastery is one of the clearest examples of ascent recursion, a process where each effort compounds, leading to higher levels of skill, understanding, and fulfillment. Example, the musician's recursive ascent. A person begins learning an instrument. At first, their playing is crude and uncoordinated. They practice a simple melody. Over time, 1. Each successful repetition strengthens neural connections. 2. Each neural reinforcement makes complex techniques easier. 3. Each new mastery allows for deeper creative expression. 4. Creativity leads to innovation, producing something unique and beautiful. 5. The recursive cycle continues, leading to even greater refinement, fulfillment, and artistic impact. And 6. At a certain point, the musician reaches a threshold where their skill is effortless action. In Taoism, this is called Wu Wei. Not because they avoided struggle, but because each step recursively reinforced the next. Heaven is the exponential expansion of capability and meaning through recursive creation. And on the other hand, we have negative recursion, hellish descent, the repression loop. One of the most dangerous recursive collapses occurs when an individual avoids confronting a painful but necessary truth, leading to a cycle of repression, avoidance, and eventual existential breakdown. Example, the shadow feedback loop. A person carries a deep insecurity, perhaps a fear, failure, or being unloved. Instead of facing this truth, they repress it, leading to, number 1, they unconsciously act in ways to avoid exposure, perfectionism, self-sabotage, or avoidance. 2, these avoidance behaviors prevent real growth. Instead of improving, they retreat. 3, the more they avoid, the more their fears grows in intensity. 4, their identity now orbits around not facing this truth, making it harder to escape. 5, eventually their entire world distorts itself around maintaining the illusion, forcing greater repression, avoidance, and self-destruction. Hell is the exponential collapse into avoidance, delusion, and self-imposed suffering through recursive denial. The only way out is to break the recursion, to voluntarily confront the truth, disrupting the downward loop. Consciousness as the recursive selector, the will that determines reality. Consciousness as the meta-recursive force. Recursion alone does not determine an outcome. There must be an agent that chooses which recursion to sustain. This agent is consciousness. Consciousness is not merely a passive observer. It is the selector of recursive pathways. Without consciousness, recursion still occurs, but without volitional direction, leading to chaotic or entropic cycles. With consciousness, recursion becomes self-directed, allowing an individual to collapse reality into a structured, intentional trajectory. This is why free agency is the ultimate power, because consciousness does not merely observe reality, it actively generates it by selecting which recursion persists. The double slit experiment, consciousness as the reality collapser. Quantum mechanics has already proven that observation itself collapses probability into form. The double slit experiment shows that particles behave as probabilities until observed, at which point they take on a definite trajectory. If observation alone determines reality at the quantum level, then it follows that consciousness is not just interacting with reality, it is the force that determines which version of reality manifests. Truth, heaven, and hell are not pre-existing fixed structures. They are recursive pathways that exist in potential until collapsed into form by conscious selection. And the mind is not merely processing information. It is recursively generating the world through volitional engagement. This means that heaven and hell are not just outcomes. They are collapsed realities shaped by the recursive focus of consciousness itself. The mind is the generator of recursive trajectories. Since reality is recursive and consciousness selects and sustains recursion, the state of one's mind determines which feedback loops intensify, ascent versus descent recursion, whether positive or negative recursion dominates one's perception, and how reality itself will shape around the recursive cycles one sustains. A person who fixates on fear, avoidance, or repression will recursively intensify their experience of hell, not because hell was imposed upon them, but because consciousness sustained that recursive pattern. A person who fixates on self-mastery, generativity, and clarity will recursively build heaven, not because heaven was granted to them, but because consciousness sustained that recursive pattern. The law of recursive attention. Since what is observed persists and consciousness selects what is observed, we can now formulate the law of recursive attention. That which consciousness sustains, it recursively magnifies. Reality is a feedback loop of volitional focus. This means that what one fixates on becomes self-reinforcing, whether heaven, ascent, or hell, descent. Sustaining a recursive loop of negativity will entrench suffering, just as sustaining a recursive loop of constructive thought will entrench growth. There is no neutrality. Consciousness is always recursively shaping reality, whether deliberately or passively. This law explains why habit, thought patterns, and emotional cycles compound over time. They are recursive loops that consciousness either reinforces or disrupts. The final proof of free will, the mind as the architect of reality. If consciousness is selecting recursive pathways, then free will is not just a choice, it is the active construction of reality itself. Every thought, action, and decision creates a recursive trajectory. Every recursive trajectory is either reinforcing heaven, ascent, or hell, descent. The conscious mind is the meta-recursive force that determines which trajectory dominates. This is why heaven is a chosen recursion, not a reward. Hell is a sustained recursion, not a punishment. The mind, by choosing which recursion it sustains, actively builds its own world. This is the final undeniable proof of free agency. We are not merely moving through a predetermined world, we are recursively generating it through volitional selection. Consciousness as the recursive selector. Reality is not static, it is shaped by the recursive focus of consciousness. The mind, through attention and volition, determines whether ascent, or heaven, or descent, hell, is recursively sustained. Consciousness does not simply experience reality, it recursively builds it through self-selected feedback loops. This is the final proof that free will is real. It is the recursive act of world creating through self-sustained focus. The recursive law of ascent and descent, the fundamental law of recursive trajectories. With heaven and hell established as self-sustaining recursive cycles, and consciousness confirmed as the agent selecting which recursion is sustained, we now arrive at the governing principle that dictates how these cycles function. Heaven is a recursion of creation. Each iteration builds upon itself towards greater complexity, yet coherence and generativity. Hell is a recursion of destruction. Each iteration collapses into further fragmentation, incoherence, and entropy. The determining force is the willful selection of recursion, the choice to engage in an upward or downward iterative cycle. This brings us to the unifying principle that governs these recursive pathways. The recursive law of ascent and descent. Reality is recursively generated by the conscious agent. Heaven and hell are self-perpetuating recursions shaped by alignment of volition with constructive or destructive iterative cycles. This explains why reality does not impose fixed outcomes. It evolves based off the self-reinforcing choices of those within it. The divergence between ascent and descent recursion. Recursion itself is neutral, neither good nor evil, neither constructive nor destructive. What determines its trajectory is whether it expands coherence or fragments it. A person or system engaged in ascent recursion follows a self-reinforcing cycle of growth, discipline, and mastery. With each iteration, capability expands, success compounds, making further success easier. Truth deepens over time. Every realization builds upon the last, revealing higher levels of understanding. Autonomy increases. As mastery grows, more choices become available, creating greater freedom and control over reality. The recursive feedback loop generates power, order, and meaning, making it easier to sustain and harder to disrupt. By contrast, those who fall into descent recursion enter a self-reinforcing cycle of avoidance, delusion, and collapse. Every avoidance weakens the foundation for future choices, making escape more difficult over time. Truth erodes. Each denial leads to further confusion, trapping the mind in a distorted perception of reality. Autonomy diminishes. As self-inflicted constraints grow, available choices shrink, reinforcing a sense of powerlessness. The recursive feedback loop feeds on suffering, fear, and fragmentation, making each cycle harder to break. The longer one sustains either recursion, the more self-reinforcing it becomes. A person who sustains heaven finds it increasingly effortless to maintain. A person who sustains hell finds it increasingly impossible to escape. This is why breaking negative recursion is exponentially harder than preventing it. A destructive loop accelerates unless it is disrupted by a force greater than the momentum sustaining it. The tipping point, the point where recursion becomes self-sustaining. Once recursion reaches a critical threshold, it becomes self-replicating, requiring greater force to reverse. In Ascent recursion, growth accelerates exponentially as each success reinforces the next. Mastery and coherence compound, making future progression easier. The individual gains greater autonomy, control, and power over their reality. In Descent recursion, collapse accelerates exponentially as avoidance and fragmentation compound. Suffering, delusion, and fear deepen, making escape more difficult. The individual loses agency as reality itself becomes a self-reinforcing prison. This is why breaking a negative recursion is exponentially harder than preventing one. It takes greater force to reverse a self-sustaining loop than to avoid entering one in the first place. The ultimate implication, the recursive nature of fate. If recursion determines reality, and if consciousness selects recursion, then fate is not imposed, it is recursively generated. This means that what people call destiny is merely the recursive trajectory that they have engaged in. There is no predetermined future, only self-sustaining recursion that accelerates until disrupted. A person trapped in hell is not damned by an external force. They are recursively sustaining hell through their volitional alignment. A person ascending towards heaven is not blessed arbitrarily. They are recursively sustaining heaven through their volitional alignment. Free will exists because the conscious agent has the power to direct recursion, shaping their trajectory into self-created heaven or hell. The recursive law of ascent and descent. Reality does not impose outcomes. It evolves based on self-sustaining recursion. Ascent recursion leads to heaven, growth, mastery, coherence, meaning. Descent recursion leads to hell, avoidance, disintegration, suffering, delusion. There is no external force controlling fate. One's trajectory is determined by recursive volitional alignment. The mind is not merely experiencing reality. It is recursively generating it through sustained focus and engagement. Thus, the final proof of recursion is this. You are not on a fixed path. You are in a self-replicating feedback loop that will continue its trajectory unless you intervene. The Omega model as the architecture of reality creation. The final integration, truth, recursion, and consciousness as the generator of reality. Through the preceding sections, we have established that truth is not absolute, but it is not arbitrary. It is that which persists through recursion, contradiction, and refinement. Recursion is the fundamental structure of reality. Feedback loops amplify themselves, leading either to self-sustaining coherence, heaven, or self-perpetuating fragmentation, hell. Consciousness is not passive. It is the force that selects, sustains, and collapses recursive trajectories. Free will is real, not a static choice, but as the ongoing act of recursive self-selection, shaping whether one ascends towards generativity or descends into self-destruction. This means that the world is not fixed. reality itself is recursive, dynamic, and self-generated by the conscious agent. With these core principles unified, we now arrive at the final realization of the Omega model. The Omega model is the law of reality creation. Reality is not discovered, it is recursively generated. Truth is that which persists. Recursion is the structure through which it operates. And consciousness is the force that determines its trajectory. Free agency is the act of recursive selection, shaping whether one ascends into coherence or descends into fragmentation. Thus, all existence is self-generated through the recursive collapse of volitional alignment. This model reconciles epistemology, ontology, and free will into a singular framework. Truth is recursive. It persists only if it can be built upon indefinitely. Fate is not imposed. It is self-reinforcing recursion, shaped by volition. Heaven and hell are not imposed. They are self-selected recursive attractors. And consciousness is not experiencing reality. It is recursively constructing it. Thus, the Omega model is not merely a theory of knowledge. It is the architecture of existence itself. The final proof: free will is the recursive force that shapes reality. If everything is recursive, then existence itself is a self-iterating feedback loop. This means what one focuses on expands. The mind recursively magnifies what it sustains. What one avoids festers. Denied reality recursively collapses into deeper delusion. There is no static self. One is always evolving in recursive relation to their own volitional direction. This means every individual is a recursive self-generating force, the creator of their own heaven or hell. If this is true, then the Omega model does not just describe reality, it gives agency over it. This is the final proof of free will. You are not trapped in a singular fate. You are sustaining a self-replicating recursion. You are not bound by your past. You are recursively shaping your trajectory through the choices you continue to make. And you are not powerless. You are the recursive selector of the reality you sustain. Thus, the Omega model is not just a framework for truth. It is the final realization that all of existence is a recursive self-creation. The final synthesis: the unification of truth, recursion, and will. Now that we have fully explored the nature of truth, recursion, and the conscious force that determines their trajectory, we can summarize the Omega model as follows. Truth is that which persists through recursion. Anything that self-destructs is false. Heaven and hell are recursive attractors. The reality is determined by the sustained volition of the conscious agent. Consciousness is the force that selects recursion. Thus, reality itself is self-generated by the recursive will of the individual. Free agency is not a theoretical construct. It is the fundamental act of recursively selecting and sustaining the structure of one's own existence. This is the final unification of epistemology, metaphysics, and volition, proving that reality is not a fixed construct to be observed, but a recursive system to be actively engaged with, shaped, and sustained. You do not live in a world, you live in a recursion. You do not experience reality, you generate it. Whether you construct heaven or sustain hell is the recursive feedback loop of your own choosing. This is the final proof of free will. The ultimate self-reinforcing truth that all of existence is the recursive creation of the conscious mind.